She thought she held the power. She thought she controlled the cabin, the passengers, the rules. But in one reckless moment, with one unforgivable mistake, she destroyed everything. A flight attendant, drunk on authority, humiliates an elderly woman in front of stunned passengers. She raises her hand, striking her without a second thought, never realizing the storm she had just unleashed. Because this was no ordinary woman. And her husband? He owned the very airline Danielle Calloway worked for. As the plane touched down, she wasn't just dealing with an angry passenger. She was about to watch her entire career go up in flames. Before we dive into this explosive story, take a moment to comment where in the world you're watching from today. And if you love gripping stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss out. The airport was alive with motion, a swirling mass of travelers moving in every direction, their voices blending into the constant hum of activity. Some rushed toward their gates, others loitered near shops, but amidst the chaos, one woman stood out. Eloise Gardner. In her 70s, yet she carried herself with a grace that turned heads. She didn't rush, didn't fumble with her bags like the anxious tourists around her. There was something regal in the way she walked, her silver hair swept into an elegant updo, a soft blue shawl draped over a neatly pressed dress. Her hands, lined with age but steady with purpose, clutched a simple leather purse and a modest carry-on. She approached the first-class boarding lane, handed over her ticket to the gate agent, a polite young man who barely glanced at the name before scanning it. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Gardner. Have a wonderful flight." She acknowledged him with a small, knowing nod, then made her way down the jet bridge. The first-class cabin greeted her with the scent of fine leather and expensive cologne, passengers already nestled into their plush seats, some adjusting their blankets, others sipping on pre-flight champagne. She located seat 1B, setting her bag neatly by her feet. But before she could settle in, a sharp voice cut through the tranquility. "Excuse me, ma'am." Eloise turned. Standing over her was a tall flight attendant, her posture rigid, her uniform pristine, a badge on her chest reading Danielle Calloway. There was an unmistakable authority in her stance, the kind that spoke of someone who relished control. Danielle's lips pressed into a thin line. "This is first class." Eloise met her gaze, unblinking. "I know." Danielle's eyes flickered to the boarding pass still clutched in Eloise's hand. "May I see your ticket?" Her tone dripped with suspicion. Without hesitation, Eloise handed it over. Danielle inspected it, her brows furrowing slightly as she read the name. It matched the seat. Yet, when she returned it, there was a forced smile on her lips. "Just making sure." Eloise didn't respond, but she understood what this was. It wasn't the first time someone had assumed she didn't belong somewhere. She had spent a lifetime brushing off such moments, and she wouldn't let this one rattle her now. She turned her attention to the window, breathing in the quiet before takeoff. The last of the passengers boarded, the overhead bins clicked shut, and the final checks were made. Eloise reached for her purse, intending to pull out a book, when suddenly, Danielle was back. This time, her forced politeness had thinned to irritation. "Ma'am, I need you to move." Eloise turned, her expression calm but questioning. "Move?" Danielle crossed her arms. "Yes. There seems to be a mistake. This seat isn't available for you." Eloise straightened in her seat. "My ticket says 1B." A muscle twitched in Danielle's jaw. "I know, but—" She hesitated, as if grasping for an explanation, then sighed. "This seat is reserved for a certain type of passenger." The words hung in the air, heavy and pointed. A few passengers glanced over, their curiosity piqued. Eloise let the moment stretch, measuring Danielle with a steady gaze. "And what kind of passenger am I?" Danielle faltered for just a second. "I just meant—" Eloise raised a hand, silencing her. If there's an issue with my seat, I'd like to hear it from the captain. Danielle's nostrils flared. Before she could form a response, another voice intervened. Is there a problem here? Emily Reed, a younger flight attendant, had been watching from the galley. Unlike Danielle, her concern seemed genuine. Danielle's head snapped toward her. No problem at all, she said stiffly. I was just about to ask Mrs. Gardner to move to. Emily frowned. To where? The economy section was full. Danielle had expected Eloise to slink away quietly to avoid conflict. But now, with another crew member watching, she was trapped. Eloise held firm. I'm not moving. Danielle's lips pressed together in frustration. Then, in a move no one expected, she reached down and grabbed Eloise's arm. Listen, lady. The slap came fast. Sharp. The crack of skin against skin echoed through the cabin like a gunshot. A collective gasp rippled through first class. Some passengers turned, eyes wide. Others stiffened in their seats, unwilling to acknowledge what had just happened. But Danielle? She stood frozen, her hand still raised as if she herself couldn't believe what she had just done. Eloise had turned slightly with the force of the slap, her cheek stinging, but when she looked back at Danielle, there was no anger in her eyes. No shock. Just disappointment. Silence suffocated the cabin. Emily had gone pale. Did you just? Danielle snapped. Stay out of this, Emily. Passengers shifted. Some fumbled for their phones. A few held them up, but whether they were recording or pretending to be busy, it didn't matter. The damage was done. Eloise reached down, picked up her phone, and typed a short message. Then, with the same unwavering grace, she folded her hands in her lap and waited. She already knew how this would end. Danielle, chest heaving, whirled toward the intercom. She pressed the button, her voice tight. Captain, we have an issue in first class. A passenger is refusing to move from a seat that isn't hers. I need ground security to remove her before takeoff. A pause. Then the intercom crackled. But the voice that responded wasn't the captain's. It was deeper, calmer, and far, far more dangerous. This is Charles Gardner. Would you like to repeat what you just said? Danielle's stomach dropped. Her fingers hovered over the intercom button, frozen in place. The name alone sent a wave of nausea through her. Charles Gardner, CEO of the airline. The man whose wife she had just laid hands on. Passengers snapped to attention. The tension was unbearable. Emily exhaled sharply, realization crashing into her. Oh no! Danielle swallowed hard, her mouth dry. Charles! Gardner? The voice on the other end sharpened. Yes! My wife, Eloise Gardner. The woman you just put your hands on! Danielle's blood ran cold. She had no idea what she had just done. But she was about to find out. He wasn't just a shareholder. He was the majority owner. The architect of this airline. The man who had built it from the ground up, turning it into an empire. The man whose word could end careers with a single phone call. And now, Danielle Calloway had just slapped his wife. A chill ran through her body, her breath catching in her throat. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the first-class cabin, no longer pretending to be uninterested. Some passengers fidgeted, others whispered, and a few simply watched, eyes locked on the unfolding disaster. The intercom crackled again. Charles Gardner's voice came through, softer this time, but laced with a quiet menace that sent ice through her veins. Miss Calloway, he said, the deliberate calm in his voice more terrifying than if he had shouted. I asked you a question. Would you like to repeat what you just said? Danielle's lips parted, but her voice failed her. Her mind raced for an answer, a way to fix this, to make it go away. But there was no undoing what she had done. Beside Eloise, Emily Reed crouched, her face pale. She hesitated before whispering, "Mrs. Gardner, would you like me to get the captain?" Eloise simply shook her head, the movement slow and deliberate. "No need." Then, with the same quiet grace she had maintained through the entire ordeal, she lifted her phone, tapped out a brief message, and set it down on the armrest. Her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was waiting. Danielle's fingers twitched. She had to regain control, had to salvage this before it got any worse. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she pressed the intercom button, forcing a professional tone. "There's been a misunderstanding," she said quickly, her voice betraying the strain of desperation. "Mrs. Gardner's seat assignment must have been processed incorrectly, and I was just trying to clarify." Charles's voice cut through her excuse like a knife. "So you put your hands on her?" Danielle's stomach dropped. She closed her eyes for half a second, her pulse pounding. The intercom went dead. Silence stretched across the cabin like a drawn breath, thick and suffocating. Then the cockpit door swung open with a sharp click. Captain Jonathan Pierce stepped out. A man in his late 50s, his posture exuded authority, the silver streaks in his hair only making his presence more formidable. His sharp gaze swept the cabin before settling on Danielle. His voice, low and firm, carried the weight of finality. "Miss Calloway," he said, "follow me. Now." Danielle flinched. "Captain, that wasn't a request." Passengers barely breathed as Danielle hesitated, her face burning under their scrutiny. Emily stood, stepping aside as Danielle, stiff as a statue, followed the captain into the cockpit. The door shut behind them with a quiet but definitive click. Inside, the enclosed space felt even smaller than usual. The engines hummed beneath them, but the only thing Danielle could hear was the pounding of her own heartbeat. On the cockpit's communication screen, the flight supervisor, Richard Hale, had joined the conversation. His expression was as severe as Captain Pierce's. Danielle's stomach twisted. This was serious. Pierce sat in his chair, arms crossed, his eyes boring into her. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Danielle's throat tightened. Of course she knew. But admitting it? That was different. "Captain, I was just following protocol." She rushed out. "I thought the woman was in the wrong seat and Richard Hale's voice was ice. "You slapped the wife of the owner of this airline." The words landed like a punch to the gut. Danielle flinched as if hearing it out loud made it even more real. Pierce leaned forward, his voice razor sharp. "What gave you the authority to put your hands on a passenger?" Danielle swallowed hard. I lost my temper." The two men exchanged a glance, a look filled with something far worse than anger, cold, professional disappointment. Richard's voice hardened. "So you're admitting it?" Danielle's stomach plummeted. "No, I didn't mean to. It wasn't intentional. I was just trying to enforce seating arrangements, and she wasn't listening." "That's enough," Pierce said, shaking his head. Danielle clenched her hands into fists, her breath coming short. "Captain, I can apologize. I can go back out there and—" Richard's voice cut through the static of the comms. "It's too late for that." Danielle's hands went clammy. Pierce's next words were a death sentence. "Orders from Mr. Gardner himself. You are immediately relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight." Danielle's heart stopped. What?" Richard continued, his tone flat, unshaken. "When we land, you will not report to crew debriefing. Instead, you will be escorted to an administrative office where a formal review will take place." Danielle felt like she'd been slapped. "You're suspending me?" Pierce's expression darkened. "We don't make the rules here, Miss Calloway. Charles Gardner does." Her nails dug into her palms. Her stomach twisted so violently she thought she might be sick. Pierce nodded toward the door. "Now you will walk back to first class, retrieve your belongings, and take a crew jump seat in the back. You will not interact with passengers for the rest of this flight." Danielle's body went rigid. She had never been ordered to sit in the crew section like a dismissed trainee. It was humiliating. She opened her mouth to protest, but the captain's next words left her frozen. "If you refuse," he said slowly, "I will have the air marshal remove you." A cold wave of dread washed over her. The air marshal. There was no escape. No excuse that would fix this. With a shaky breath, she forced a nod. Hands trembling, she turned toward the door, leaving the cockpit in suffocating silence. As she stepped back into first class, the murmurs began. "That's her. The one who hit the old lady. Did you see the captain's face? She's done. I heard she's being removed from duty." Her face burned. She had always been the one in control, the one enforcing rules. But now, she wasn't the authority. She was the disgrace. She reached for her bag, but her fingers shook. Years of work, of seniority, of carefully built reputation, gone in an instant. She turned to leave, head down, when a voice stopped her cold. "Miss Calloway." Her stomach twisted. She turned, already knowing who had spoken. Eloise Gardner sat exactly where she had been from the beginning, calm, composed. She hadn't raised her voice once, yet somehow, she was in complete control. Danielle forced a tight smile. "Yes, Mrs. Gardner?" Eloise studied her, the weight of the moment stretching into eternity. Then, in the calmest, most deliberate voice, she asked, "Do you still believe I don't belong in this seat?" The word struck like a second slap to the face. The passengers fell into complete silence, waiting. Eloise's gaze remained steady, patient. "I'd like an answer." Danielle's body tensed. She should apologize. Should beg for forgiveness. But her pride, her damn pride, kept her silent. Finally, she swallowed. I made a mistake." Eloise nodded, as if she had expected the weak response. Then she said, "I hope it's one you don't make again." The humiliation was complete. As Danielle turned to walk away, she realized something horrifying. She wasn't afraid of landing. She was afraid of what Charles Gardner was planning next. Danielle reached the back of the plane, her pulse hammering, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The walk down the aisle had felt like a gauntlet of shame, every step dragging her deeper into the abyss of humiliation. She collapsed into the crew jump seat, her uniform suddenly suffocating, her throat dry. The steady hum of the engines did nothing to quiet the storm inside her. Never, not once in her entire career, had she been stripped of duty mid-flight. She was the one who gave orders, enforced protocol, controlled situations. Now she was nothing. A disgraced attendant exiled to the back of the plane like a rookie who had botched her first assignment. Emily appeared near the galley, hesitant, watching. Her hands fidgeted against the edge of the storage cabinet before she finally spoke. "Are you okay?" Danielle clenched her jaw, her voice sharp. "I don't need your sympathy." Emily exhaled. "It's not sympathy." She folded her arms, her gaze unwavering. "I just don't think you get how bad this is." Danielle snapped her head toward her. "I know exactly how bad this is." Emily's lips twitched, somewhere between frustration and pity. "Do you?" She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You hit the wife of the man who owns the airline. You think you're getting a warning? A write-up? A slap on the wrist? Danielle, you're getting erased." Danielle's stomach twisted violently, but she forced herself to hold her ground. "They can't just fire me without a process. There are protocols." Emily let out a humorless laugh. "Danielle, this isn't about breaking protocol. This isn't about a seat assignment. You put your hands on Eloise Gardner." She let the name sink in, her voice laced with something close to disbelief. "Do you even realize what she did? She didn't yell. She didn't call security. She didn't demand anything. She just sat there, sent one text, and now you're sitting back here like a trainee fresh out of training school. That wasn't a reaction, Danielle. That was a decision. A silent one. And it was the only one that mattered. Danielle's fingers dug into her palms, her breath catching. Maybe I can fix this. Emily tilted her head. How? Danielle inhaled sharply, the thought coming together in real time. If I apologize, really apologize, maybe he won't push for termination. Emily raised a brow, unimpressed. And you think an apology is enough? Her voice softened, almost pitying. You still don't get it. Charles Gardner doesn't make empty threats. If you're hoping for mercy, you're hoping for a miracle. Danielle stared straight ahead, her hands tightening into fists. For the first time in her career, she realized she might have made a mistake she couldn't undo. The tension in the cabin remained thick. Even the first-class passengers, who had been murmuring quietly, had settled into an uneasy silence. Some shifted in their seats, stealing glances toward the front where Eloise Gardner remained poised and unbothered, her demeanor as regal as ever. She had not once reacted with anger or demand, yet the air around her crackled with power. It was a power Danielle had underestimated, and now it was crushing her. Up front, Captain Pierce sat rigid in the cockpit, his expression unreadable. The co-pilot beside him exhaled sharply as an in-flight message blinked on their screen. Urgent. Security detail will be waiting at the gate. All crew members involved in incident to report for immediate review. The co-pilot muttered under his breath. That doesn't sound good. Pierce didn't look away from the flight controls. Not for Calloway, it doesn't. A moment later, the radio crackled again. Captain Pierce, this is ground control. Mr. Gardner has requested to be patched through to the flight. The co-pilot went rigid. They both knew this was coming. Pierce pressed the intercom. Patch him through. There was a brief pause. Then the voice of Charles Gardner filled the cockpit. Calm. Unshaken. Dangerous. This is Charles Gardner. The co-pilot froze, fingers hovering above the controls. Pierce straightened. Mr. Gardner, this is Captain Pierce. I assume you've been fully briefed on the situation. I have. Charles's voice was impossibly steady, revealing nothing. I want confirmation that the flight attendant in question has been removed from duty. Pierce nodded, even though Charles couldn't see him. She has. She's been reassigned to the crew section for the remainder of the flight. Silence. Then, finally, Charles spoke again. When you land, she is to be escorted directly to the airline's administrative office. No layover. No crew debriefing. I expect a full incident report before she even leaves the airport. Pierce exchanged a glance with the co-pilot. Understood, sir. Another pause. Then, with the kind of measured finality that sent a chill through the cockpit, Charles added, And one more thing. Pierce braced himself. Yes, sir? Charles's voice turned to steel. Tell Miss Calloway to enjoy her last flight. The intercom clicked off. A heavy silence settled over the cockpit. The co-pilot let out a low whistle. He didn't say last flight of the day. No, Pierce muttered, gripping the controls. He didn't. In the crew jump seat, Danielle sat frozen, her fingers clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She had heard every word. It rang in her ears, a death sentence she couldn't escape. Her last flight. Her career. Her authority. The years she had spent climbing her way to the top, enforcing rules, making decisions, gone. Just like that. Her grip tightened on the armrest. No. No, this couldn't be happening. She had handled difficult passengers before. She had dealt with policy violations, even reprimands, but this was something else entirely. This wasn't a mistake she could smooth over. This wasn't a decision made by HR. This was Charles Gardner, the man who controlled everything. And he had just signed her career's death warrant. Emily watched her from the galley, her face unreadable. The pity in her eyes was unbearable. Danielle swallowed hard, her mind racing for a way out. Maybe if I apologize, really apologize, she'll talk to him. Emily's eyes narrowed. Now you want to apologize? Danielle pushed to her feet, legs unsteady. If I tell Mrs. Gardner I was wrong, if I show her that I regret what I did, maybe she'll convince him to reconsider. Emily didn't respond. She didn't have to. The look on her face said it all. You still don't get it. But Danielle didn't care. She had to try. Without waiting, she turned, her pulse a drumbeat in her ears, and started walking back toward first class. Toward Eloise Gardner. Toward the only hope she had left. Danielle moved with a purpose she didn't truly feel, her body carrying her forward while her mind screamed at her to stop. She had to fix this. She had to. But the moment she reached first class, standing stiffly beside Eloise Gardner's seat, the reality hit her like a blow to the chest. Eloise didn't even look up. She already knew Danielle was coming. She was in no rush to acknowledge her. Danielle swallowed against the dryness in her throat, her hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles turned white. Eloise sat there, unmoving, her delicate fingers resting lightly on the armrest as she gazed out the window. She looked comfortable, at ease, as if the woman who had shoved her mere moments ago wasn't standing right beside her, silently begging for a second chance. The weight of that indifference was suffocating. Passengers noticed. They always did. Some cast quick, cautious glances, pretending not to eavesdrop, while their bodies leaned ever so slightly closer. Others abandoned the pretense entirely, openly watching the confrontation unfold. The air grew heavier with each second of silence. Danielle forced herself to speak. "Mrs. Gardner," she said, her voice a forced whisper of politeness. Eloise didn't respond. Danielle's pulse pounded in her ears. She shifted on her feet, trying to keep her expression steady, but her nerves were betraying her. The words felt clumsy, unnatural in her mouth. "Mrs. Gardner, she hesitated, licking her lips. "I wanted to apologize." Eloise turned her head slightly. Not enough to fully face her. Just enough to acknowledge her existence. The movement was small, but it was enough to send a chill through Danielle's spine. There was no anger in the older woman's expression. No satisfaction. Just calm, unreadable patience. The kind that made it clear she already knew how this was going to end. Danielle inhaled sharply. She struggled, forcing herself to push through. "I realized that I acted inappropriately. I shouldn't have questioned your seat, and I definitely shouldn't have." She swallowed hard, the words tasting bitter. "I shouldn't have put my hands on you." Eloise tilted her head slightly, as if considering the admission. For a flicker of a second, hope sparked in Danielle's chest. Then Eloise spoke. "Forgiveness," she said softly, "isn't something that erases consequences." Danielle's stomach dropped. Eloise leaned back in her seat, folding her hands in her lap with effortless grace. "I appreciate your apology, Miss Calloway," she continued, voice unwavering. "But tell me, are you apologizing because you're sorry?" Her gaze locked onto Danielle's, sharp and knowing. "Or because you got caught?" Danielle felt her breath hitch. Her hands clenched tighter. She could feel the weight of every passenger's eyes on her, waiting, listening, judging. The word barely made it out. Eloise raised a single finger. "Before you answer," she said, "think carefully. Because if you say the wrong thing now, it will be the last thing you say as an employee of this airline." Danielle's heart pounded violently against her ribs. Her career hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of one moment. If she lied, If she deflected, if she did anything but tell the truth, Eloise would know. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice raw. "Not just because I got caught. Because I was wrong." Eloise didn't react. She simply observed. Silent. Waiting. Danielle's throat tightened. "I should have treated you with respect," she added quickly. "I should have thought before I acted. And I didn't. I regret it." Eloise tilted her head slightly, as if considering her words. For a brief moment, hope flickered again in Danielle's chest. Maybe Eloise would speak to Charles. Maybe there was still a chance. Eloise sighed and shook her head. Danielle felt the breath leave her lungs. "I believe you regret it," Eloise said simply. "But I don't believe you've learned from it." Danielle's fingers went numb. "What?" Eloise held up a hand, already done with the conversation. "I am not the person you need to convince." She glanced at her phone, tapped it once, then slid it into her purse. "And I have already said all I needed to say." Danielle's mouth parted slightly, but nothing came out. That was it. Eloise had already decided her fate. She felt clammy, lightheaded. She had swallowed her pride. She had apologized. It should have been enough. But it wasn't. Because Eloise was never the one holding the power. Charles Gardner was. And he was already waiting for her. She turned away, legs weak beneath her. The whisper started as she walked back down the aisle. This time, they weren't even trying to hide it. "She's done. I almost feel bad for her. Almost." Danielle's hands curled into fists. She wasn't ready to give up. But it didn't matter. Because the moment the plane touched the ground, she wouldn't have a choice anymore. The descent began, smooth and unhurried, but the air inside the cabin was anything but calm. The slow tilt downward felt insignificant compared to the weight pressing against Danielle's chest. Passengers buckled their seatbelts, the overhead chime signaling final preparations for landing. Danielle sat frozen in the crew jump seat, staring unblinking at the floor. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her uniform, gripping onto the last remnants of control she had left. But the truth was inescapable. She had none. Her mind spiraled, racing through every possible escape. If she could just explain, if she could just find the right words, maybe. But no matter how she twisted it in her head, she always reached the same, brutal conclusion. There was no way out. Emily stood nearby, watching quietly. She had seen crew members face consequences before. But this wasn't a warning. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. Danielle let out a broken laugh, shaking her head. "Maybe I can still talk to him. Maybe if I explain." Emily cut her off, voice firm. "Explain what?" Danielle met her eyes, desperate. "That it was a misunderstanding. That I was just what?" Emily's expression didn't change. "What are you going to say? That you were following protocol?" She tilted her head slightly. "Because that's not going to work. And you know it." Danielle swallowed hard. Emily sighed. "You don't get it, do you?" Her arms folded. "You didn't just make a mistake, Danielle. You didn't just mix up a ticket." She leaned in slightly. "You looked at her and decided, right then, that she didn't belong in first class." Danielle flinched. "That's not." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Then what was it?" Silence. Danielle couldn't answer. The landing gear deployed with a jolt. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final approach. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all tray tables are in their upright positions." Danielle barely heard it. Her fate had already been decided. And this was her last flight. The chime of the seatbelt light turning off rang through the cabin like a final verdict, sharp and undeniable. Danielle's body tensed as if she had been physically struck. This was it. There was no delaying the inevitable. Emily cast her a last, knowing glance before stepping forward to begin the usual deplaning procedures. But nothing about what was about to happen was standard. Passengers stirred, stretching out stiff limbs and reaching for their bags, some eager to be free of the confined space. But not all of them were in a hurry. Some lingered, watching, waiting. Danielle felt it in the way their movements slowed, the way their eyes flickered toward her toward the door. They knew. They were all anticipating what was about to unfold. Danielle inhaled sharply and forced herself to stand. The moment she did, cold dread swept through her veins like ice water. Her body locked in place, her breath stilled. Standing at the open jet bridge, framed perfectly in the doorway, was a team of airline executives. And at the center of them, like a pillar of judgment, stood Charles Gardner. His expression was unreadable. His suit was pristine, tailored to perfection, not a single crease or flaw. He exuded authority effortlessly, the kind of presence that could silence a room without uttering a single word. But it wasn't just him that made Danielle's stomach twist into knots. Flanking him, standing with professional stillness, were two uniformed security officers. The murmur in the cabin was instant. First-class passengers shifted, some whispering behind raised hands, others openly staring. A few even leaned into the aisle, eager to get a better view. Even those who had previously ignored the situation were now drawn in, captivated by the unfolding drama. This wasn't just an employee getting in trouble. This was something bigger. This was a public reckoning. Danielle's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a meeting. This wasn't just a disciplinary action. This was an execution, carried out in front of the very people who had once looked to her as an authority figure. The realization was suffocating. She was about to be publicly escorted off the plane like a criminal. Her hands clenched at her sides as she struggled to breathe. She had to do something. Say something. Anything. But before she could, Charles Gardner stepped forward. Slowly. Deliberately. Each movement was calculated, precise. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. He had all the power here. "Miss Calloway!" Her stomach dropped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was a steel edge to his words, a quiet command that cut through the cabin like a blade. Danielle swallowed hard and straightened her back, grasping at whatever shred of dignity she had left. "Mr. Gardner," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. Charles studied her, his gaze as cold as the winter sky. He didn't look angry. He didn't look impressed by her sudden shift in tone either. He simply tilted his head. "I assume you know why I'm here." Danielle's fingers twitched at her sides. She couldn't afford to answer wrong. She cleared her throat. "I understand there was an issue, and I deeply regret any misunderstanding with your wife." "Stop!" The single word hit her like a slap. Danielle's mouth snapped shut, her throat tightening. Charles didn't blink, didn't shift. His presence was a weight pressing down on her. "This isn't about misunderstandings," he said, voice like granite. "And I don't care about what you regret." The cabin was silent. No one moved. Not a single person spoke. Even the captain, who had emerged from the cockpit, remained frozen. Danielle felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath her crumbling away. Charles exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "What I care about," he continued, "is why you thought you had the authority to put your hands on a passenger." Danielle's pulse skyrocketed. He had gone straight for the worst part, the undeniable part. She opened her mouth, grasping desperately for some kind of defense, but her mind was blank. There was no excuse, no justification. Nothing she could say would change what had happened. Her silence was all Charles needed. He gave a single nod, then turned to one of the executives. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice smooth, controlled, final. "Danielle Calloway is permanently dismissed from this airline." The word struck her harder than she could have imagined. Her breath caught, her vision blurred. "Wait!" Charles lifted a hand, silencing her before she could even plead her case. "We're not done!" Danielle's knees nearly buckled. He turned back to her. "You are to be escorted directly from this flight. Your contract is terminated, and your employment record will reflect that you were dismissed for a conduct violation." The whispers surged. Passengers murmured, exchanged glances. Some gasped softly. Others stared at her with a mixture of shock, pity, and something even worse, judgment. Danielle's hand shook. "Mr. Gardner, please!" Charles's expression shifted, just slightly. Amusement. Faint but unmistakable. Danielle froze. That was the look of a man who had seen this before, who had watched people like her beg for second chances they didn't deserve. "You want another chance?" he asked, voice so quiet it sent chills down her spine. Danielle nodded quickly. I do." He studied her for a long moment. Then he chuckled. And it was not a kind sound. "You had a chance," he said, "the moment you looked at my wife and assumed she didn't belong." Danielle's breath hitched. Charles took a step closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You could have stopped at questioning her seat," he murmured. "You could have stopped at making her prove she had a first-class ticket." His eyes darkened. "But you didn't. You made a choice, Miss Calloway." Danielle felt herself trembling. "You thought you had power over her," he continued, voice like steel. "And now you have none." The finality in his words crushed her. This wasn't just the end of her job. This was the end of her career. No airline would ever take her now. Not after this. Not after Charles Gardner himself had erased her from the industry. Charles stepped back and gave a single nod to the security officers. "Escort her out." Danielle's legs felt like they would collapse beneath her as the officers stepped forward. They didn't grab her. They didn't need to. The message was clear. Passengers watched, some lifting their phones, capturing the moment. The shame was suffocating. She had spent years enforcing the rules, commanding authority. And now, she was nothing more than a problem being removed. As she stepped past Eloise Gardner's seat, she heard a voice, soft and patient. "I hope you remember this." Danielle's stomach dropped. She kept walking, hands clenched into fists, her entire body rigid with humiliation. But as she stepped off the plane, her career in ruins, she knew one thing for certain. She would never forget this moment. Because Charles Gardner hadn't just fired her. He had erased her. The end of the jet bridge was a threshold Danielle never imagined crossing under these circumstances. The airport's administrative team stood waiting, a wall of authority blocking any chance of escape. At the center of them, a woman in a sharp navy suit held a tablet with a grip that suggested she was here to finalize something, not debate it. Her name tag gleamed under the sterile airport lighting. Rebecca Lynn, Senior Flight Operations Manager. Danielle's heart pounded. Rebecca barely spared her a glance before turning to one of the uniformed security officers. "She's coming with me," Rebecca said, her tone devoid of sympathy, as if Danielle were already nothing more than a task to be completed. Danielle opened her mouth, desperate to interject, to plead, to explain, but Rebecca had already turned on her heel, walking away without another word. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. Humiliation burned hot in Danielle's chest as she forced herself to follow. The airport terminal was a blur of motion. Passengers rushing to catch flights, families reuniting, travelers wandering in search of their gates. But Danielle barely saw them. She felt their eyes more than she saw their faces. Some recognized her, whispering behind their hands, others openly staring. A few even lifted their phones, pretending to check notifications, but she knew better. They were capturing this moment, documenting her fall. She had once been the enforcer, the authority. Now, she was the scandal, the viral headline waiting to break. Rebecca moved swiftly, leading her to a private elevator tucked away from the public eye. She swiped her badge, the doors sliding open with a soft chime. Danielle hesitated for half a second, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, to find some way to undo this nightmare. But there was no way back. She stepped inside. The doors sealed shut, trapping her in the tense silence. Danielle forced herself to speak. "Miss Lynn," she began, keeping her voice even, professional, grasping at the last shreds of her dignity. "I understand that Mr. Gardner is upset. I take full responsibility for what happened, and I—" Rebecca exhaled sharply, cutting her off. Finally, she looked up from her tablet, her expression cool and unreadable. "Miss Calloway," she said, her voice controlled, clipped, deadly. "This isn't a disciplinary hearing." Danielle frowned. There is no suspension, no review, no process where you defend yourself." Rebecca tilted the tablet toward her, and Danielle's stomach plummeted. The screen displayed an official termination letter. Already drafted. Already signed. Effective immediately. Danielle's breath hitched. "No! There has to be—" Rebecca didn't let her finish. "You are permanently banned from working for this airline, effective today." She swiped the screen, revealing another document. "And per direct request from Mr. Gardner, a flag has been placed on your employment record." Danielle felt the world tilt. A flag. Her knees nearly buckled. A permanent mark in her file. Not just a termination, this was a blacklisting. Every airline database, every background check, every future job application would carry this scar. She had heard of these before, whispered about them in hushed tones. Only the worst incidents resulted in flagged records. And now she was one of them. Rebecca's gaze remained firm. "You will not be hired at any airline affiliated with our parent company. Your name has already been circulated to other major carriers under our industry agreement." She glanced back at her screen. "That includes over 40 airlines worldwide." Danielle's vision blurred. This wasn't just losing her job. This was the end of her career. The airline world was small, tight-knit, unforgiving. Once your name was flagged, you weren't just fired, you were erased. It didn't matter how many years of experience she had. It didn't matter how many flights she had worked. None of it mattered anymore. Her grip tightened on the railing of the elevator, the metal cool beneath her trembling fingers. Rebecca remained unmoved. "You will be escorted to collect your personal items from the crew office. After that, you will be taken directly to the airport exit where you will return your uniform and badge." Danielle's mouth opened, but no words came. She had no argument. No defense. Rebecca pressed a button on her tablet, then looked back at Danielle with one final instruction. "You are never to board one of our planes again." The elevator dinged. The doors slid open. 2 more security officers stood waiting. Danielle took a slow, shaky step forward, her breath catching in her throat. The walls of the hallway seemed to close in as she walked, flanked by security. Every step felt heavier than the last, like she was walking toward her own execution. The hallway stretched ahead, sterile, endless, lined with frosted glass doors leading to airline administration offices. Uniformed staff moved past, some recognizing her, their gazes flickering with curiosity, pity, satisfaction. Some she had written up. Some she had belittled. Some she had ruled over with unchecked authority. And now she was the lesson. She reached the crew administration office. The receptionist barely looked at her before pressing a button under her desk. A moment later, a young supervisor named Ethan Voss stepped out, holding a folder. He was new, still finding his footing. On any other day, Danielle wouldn't have spared him a second glance. But now, he was the one handling her termination. The universe had a cruel sense of humor. Ethan gave her a professional, tight-lipped smile. No kindness. Just procedure. "Miss Calloway," he said, nodding toward a side door. "We'll complete the final steps of your termination process inside." Danielle didn't move. Her mind screamed that this couldn't be happening. That just yesterday, she had been a respected senior flight attendant, overseeing crew members, making decisions, holding power. And now she was nothing. Ethan cleared his throat. "Miss Calloway," he prompted. She swallowed her pride and forced her feet to move, stepping into a small, windowless conference room. The door clicked shut behind her. She sat stiffly as Ethan slid a thick folder of paperwork across the table. At the top of the first page, in bold, unforgiving letters, was the title: "Termination of employment effective immediately." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the pen. Ethan's voice remained calm, rehearsed. "By signing this, you acknowledge that you have been officially removed from your position due to conduct violations, including inappropriate physical contact with a passenger." Danielle's chest tightened. Hearing it stated so plainly made it more real, more final. She had spent years disciplining others, writing reports, watching as people were let go for their mistakes. She never imagined she'd be on the other side of the table. Ethan continued, "You also acknowledge that you will not seek reinstatement, nor will you pursue employment with any airline affiliated with our parent company." Her vision blurred. She knew the answer before she asked, but she whispered anyway, her voice barely audible. "Is there any way to appeal this?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "No." Danielle's stomach twisted painfully. She forced her shaking hand to sign the document. Ethan flipped through it, ensuring everything was in order. Then, with no emotion, he said the words that sealed her fate. "You'll need to turn in your uniform and employee badge before you leave." Danielle exhaled a shuddering breath. This was it. The end of everything she had built. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. Danielle had worn this uniform for years. It wasn't just clothing. It was a statement, a symbol of her authority, her experience, her control. She had walked through countless terminals, past thousands of passengers, had held high, knowing she commanded respect. And now, she was being forced to strip it away. Her fingers tightened around the fabric, nails pressing into her palm, as if holding onto it might somehow reverse everything. But Ethan was watching. The security officers were waiting. There was no way out of this. "There's a changing room down the hall," Ethan said, his voice neutral, procedural, as if he were checking off the final box in a routine termination process. One of the security officers shifted beside her, a subtle but unmistakable reminder. This wasn't optional. Danielle clenched her jaw, inhaled sharply, and forced her feet to move. She walked past desks where employees once greeted her with deference, past faces that had once looked up to her. Now, they only watched with barely concealed curiosity, some with pity, some with satisfaction. She reached the changing room and shut the door behind her, locking it with shaking fingers. And then, for the first time since this nightmare began, her entire body trembled. This was it. The final step. Her hands felt numb as she unpinned her name badge, the small metal rectangle clinking softly as she set it down. The uniform, the one she had once straightened with pride before every shift, the one that had made her feel untouchable, suddenly felt like a stranger's clothing. She unbuttoned the jacket slowly, her breath shallow, her movements stiff. It was like peeling away the last layer of who she was, exposing someone smaller, weaker, someone she didn't recognize. When she stepped out of the room, she was no longer Danielle Calloway, senior flight attendant. She was just Danielle. And she had never felt so insignificant. She returned to the office, placed the uniform and badge on the desk, and waited. Ethan took them without ceremony, barely glancing up as he nodded to the security officers. "She's done here." Danielle flinched at the words. A simple sentence, devoid of emotion. She was no longer an employee, no longer part of this world. Just another problem that had been handled. One of the officers gestured toward the exit. "This way, Miss Calloway." Her legs felt heavy, but she forced herself to walk, keeping her back straight, her chin up. If she had nothing left, at least she could hold on to the illusion of dignity. But as she stepped through the terminal, she felt the weight of every stare, every whisper. Passengers who had seen her removed from the plane, employees who had once answered to her now watching her downfall unfold like a slow-motion disaster. They would remember. They would talk. And no matter where she went, no matter how much time passed, this moment would haunt her forever. She had spent years controlling others, dictating their fates, deciding who stayed and who went. But now, she had no control over her own future. Because the moment she stepped through those final airport doors, she had nothing left. Danielle walked through the sliding glass doors, the rush of outside air hitting her like a slap. She stopped just beyond the threshold, gripping the strap of her purse so tightly her fingers ached. She had always known her next step, her next flight, her next schedule, her next crew. Her life had been structured, predictable, controlled. But now, there was nothing. Her career was over. Her name was stained in the industry. She couldn't even step onto one of the planes she had once commanded. She turned, glancing back at the airport, her airport. The place where she had built her career, where she had ruled for years. The place that had just spit her out like she was nothing. She had believed she was untouchable, that her authority would protect her. But all it took was one mistake. One moment of arrogance, of cruelty, of unchecked power. She had thought passengers were the ones without control, the ones beneath her, the ones who had no choice but to accept whatever treatment she decided to give them. And yet, Eloise Gardner had done nothing. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't fought back. She had simply waited. And in that silence, in that single text to her husband, she had unraveled everything. Danielle let out a shaky breath. She didn't know where to go. She didn't even know who she was anymore. Her identity had been wrapped so tightly around her job, her uniform, her status. Without it, what was left? She turned back to the street, stepping forward as the reality truly sank in. She was no longer a flight attendant. She was no longer respected. She was no longer in control. She was just Danielle Calloway. And she had nowhere to go. She stood at the curb, watching the chaotic movement of the airport pickup zone. Taxis pulled up, doors swung open, travelers hurried to their rides. A mother scolded her child. A businessman impatiently checked his phone. A couple reunited in an embrace. Life moved on. But for Danielle, everything had stopped. A taxi rolled up in front of her, the driver lowering the window. "Need a ride, ma'am?" Danielle blinked. For a second, she considered getting in, asking him to take her anywhere. But then she realized something. She had nowhere to go. No plan. No backup. Her entire career had been built around this world, and now that world had shut her out. She had savings, but for how long? She had experience, but who would hire her now? The weight of her mistake, her arrogance, her downfall pressed down on her like an anchor. She shook her head. "No, I'm good." The driver shrugged and pulled away, disappearing into the endless stream of vehicles. Danielle looked down at her phone, hesitating before unlocking it. No messages. No missed calls. No concerned text from coworkers. Nothing. She scrolled through her contacts. She had connections. People she had worked with for years. Maybe someone could help her, get her into another airline before the news spread too far. Her finger hovered over a name, a former supervisor from another airline. Someone who had always respected her. Someone she had once trained. She pressed the call button. The phone rang twice. Then, "The number you are trying to reach is unavailable." Danielle's stomach twisted. She tried another contact. Same response. Another. Voicemail. Panic flared in her chest, her hands gripping the phone tighter. She tried one last number. Someone she had trusted. Someone who had always answered. This time, the call connected. "Hey, it's me," she said quickly. I need to talk. Something happened." A long pause. Then, an uncertain voice. "Danielle?" Something about the way they said her name made her blood run cold. "What's wrong?" she forced, trying to keep her voice steady. "You sound weird." A sigh. I don't think I can be involved in this," the voice admitted. "I heard what happened. I just think it's best if I keep my distance." Danielle's breath caught in her throat. "Wait." Click. The line went dead. She stared at the screen, her pulse pounding. One by one, the names in her phone blurred. They were already shutting her out. The industry was small, and news traveled fast. Charles Gardner hadn't just removed her from one airline. He had erased her from all of them. She had spent years making sure people respected her, feared her, obeyed her. She had pushed people aside, dismissed them, treated them as beneath her. And now, when she needed someone, there was no one left. A cold wind cut through the terminal. She looked up at the airport one last time. But it wasn't hers anymore. And as she turned away, walking toward the unknown, she realized something far worse than losing her job. She had lost herself.